I've been involved in HL7 for a pretty long while, for 25 years, and scheduling is obviously covered by all of those standards. But especially if we start looking at FHIR, we see an increase in the level of interest in the use of FHIR for scheduling. And that's because we have apps, patient-facing apps. Remember, FHIR is there in part to empower the patients, not just to access their own clinical data, but there is one thing that patients want. It's to schedule or reschedule their own appointments. So hence we have a lot more interest in the scheduling area than we have had, for example, in one of the prior HL7 standards. So, what is scheduling? Scheduling is the planning of scarce resources. So everything that needs an agenda, that we need to manage in time. It's not the rubber gloves. Rubber gloves are around by the thousands. There's no need to schedule anything when it comes to that. But people and machines and rooms, that's certainly stuff that needs to be scheduled. That has an agenda. And one way of doing so, and FHIR tries to align with it, is to use the ICal standard. ICal, that's the stuff that you get when in Outlook you get a request to join some kind of meeting. That's the iCalendar standard. So FHIR, always trying to mimic industry-wide standards, tries to piggyback on that standard as much as possible. Obviously, what we have to do is to support the workflows around scheduling. And that's, first of all, obviously an appointment placer, some software application that has the capability to place an appointment, create a new appointment, to create that, to send that appointment request to a centralized scheduler, who may or may not agree with that particular request. And we need to have the functionality to query the scheduler for information. Next week, Tuesday, between 9 and 12, what do you still have in terms of availability for a piece of equipment of this type and that healthcare practitioner? Typical query in the scheduling domain. Or I may have a tracking application that's passively listening for updates as sent by the centralized scheduler. That's always the question as to who is in control. In a hospital environment, you typically tend to have a centralized scheduling application. Maybe it's the hospital information system. And then you have the radiology department. And the radiology department may not be able to schedule their own appointments. They are sort of a slave to the information that is created in the centralized scheduling application. So we need to have a subscription type of mechanism that gives me all updates related to a certain resource, for example. So let's have a look at FHIR. How does FHIR support this workflow around scheduling? Well, first of all, you need to be aware about two fundamentals when it comes to scheduling. And that's the principle of the schedule and the slot. Now, all of us are familiar with this concept, okay? Because if we look at an appointment schedule, then this appointment schedule has empty slots. So in each of those slots, we could have the name of a patient if this were to be the agenda of a healthcare provider. Over to the FHIR side of things. So on the FHIR side of things, we now have a schedule, and here we have the schedule, let's say, for January 2017 for the service type food care, okay, related to Dr. Smith, which is apparently one of the podiatricians, one of the food care specialists. And the schedule, in this case for January 2017, has time slots associated with it. And some of those slots are empty, free, as they are over there, and some of those time slots are busy, because something has been allocated to that time slot. So we have a whole bunch of slot resources that are referencing the schedule to which they belong. The cells in our agenda, basically. So we have schedule associated with a resource, in this case Dr. Smith, and the schedule has lots of slots. If we look at the wider context of what all of this, how this fits together, then in FHIR we have the schedule and the slots, as we can see here. And the schedule is always related to a particular resource. And then we move over to appointment. An appointment is really the core resource here. Because an appointment can be, as you can see, the status field thereof, an appointment can be requested. Okay, it can be something that is booked, but the patient has maybe arrived. So this appointment has various statuses. Appointment has associated participants. So it's not just maybe the practitioner and the room and the device, but also the patient. In FHIR, for the first time ever, we're actually modeling the patient. We also need permission from the patient to create an appointment. Totally novel idea in healthcare IT modeling. And if we create an appointment request, then we need an appointment response. So each of the involved resources needs to agree that next week, Tuesday, between 9 and 9:30 is actually an option. Okay. So let me give you an example. A 5-step example. Patient using an app, a hospital-provided app maybe, or in a region, and the patient says, okay, I want to create an appointment between me, Adam Everyman, I'm one of the resources involved in this appointment, and Dr. Hippocrates, and both of them are modeled in the appointment for a particular date and time. Because the patient is creating the appointment request, we are assuming that they are accepting the suggested time. Kind of makes sense if you make your own appointment that you actually are available at that point in time. But for Dr. Hippocrates, the participation has the status needs action. Dr. Hippocrates has yet to agree that he is available at that point in time. So step number 2 is for the centralized schedule manager, in this case related to Dr. Hippocrates, to create an appointment response, to indicate that I, practitioner Dr. Hippocrates, am accepting that time slot. Note that the statuses there in the appointment have not changed yet. Okay, participant is still needs action, and the overall status of the appointment is still proposed. Okay, we're still waiting for it to be finally confirmed. And then the centralized scheduler sees that, the patient has accepted, Dr. Hippocrates has accepted. Now I can start changing the statuses to, as you see, appointment is now booked, and all of the participants have accepted the appointment. Okay, so now we're done, and we also see the link, by the way, here from the participant, Dr. Hippocrates, to the corresponding slot, and the slot now has the status busy. Okay. Now, one of the alternatives is that if the Dr. Hippocrates says, well, I actually I cannot make that time slot, but I could do half an hour later, then you can actually suggest that here and go like, well, I'm rejecting it, but I'm giving you an alternative time slot. Which would mean that everything goes back to needs action, because then all parties need to agree to that new time slot. Okay. But let's follow up. So once we have the appointment for a particular time slot, and it is booked appointment with accepted participants, then those very same participants that we have, Adam Everyman and Dr. Hippocrates, also form the basis for our encounter. The encounter, after all, will be between Adam Everyman and Dr. Hippocrates. And there is a reference here to point out that the encounter is the result of a prior appointment. Okay? And the encounter, but that's the details of an encounter, is associated with an episode of care, takes place at a particular location. But that's, in and of itself, nothing new. Now we also need to have the ability to query the appointments. or to subscribe. Remember that one of the exchanges that we want to support around scheduling is the ability to subscribe, for example, to your own appointments. So appointment, like all FHIR resources, has predefined query parameters that allow you to do that. So in this case, we can just query or subscribe. That's effectively based on the same URL. So we can subscribe to appointments where the patient has a particular identifier, patient identifier, and where the status is booked, so where we have confirmed appointments, and where the date in this case starts after a date ends 2016. Remember, in our example, we were using a time slot on the 1st of January 2017. So this would allow a patient to query for appointments that they themselves have and that have been confirmed. The bottom one would be used by a healthcare provider to, in their own schedule, okay, where the actor is a particular healthcare provider, to find slots that are still free after a particular date. So these are just examples of queries or subscriptions you could use to track, to passively listen in to things that have been scheduled, in this case for a healthcare provider. Now let's zoom out a bit. These appointments have an appointment life cycle from a business standpoint. So first of all, we have to find appointments. In other words, we have to find potential open slots where we can do certain things. And as you will see in a minute, this is actually far from a trivial exercise. Because suppose my appointment does not just involve me and Dr. Hippocrates, but it involves 5, 10 or 20 different resources that all have their own schedules, that have massive of open slots. This is actually not a very trivial thing to do. So finding potential appointments is the first one, and suppose we found one next Tuesday between 9 and 9:30. But then we may need to put those slots on hold. It's not a final confirmed booking yet. I'm just making a sort of a reservation in pencil on those slots because somebody still has to fire the paperwork. For example, you cannot make a final appointment until you've sent us your insurance details. And maybe we're then going to reject it because you have no insurance. I don't know. Or until you've sent us a questionnaire with the medical details. And once we have received that, then we may wish to confirm it. So temporarily we may have to put these appointments on hold. Then we're going to book the appointment, finalize it, so to speak, accept it. And if the patient is not the initiator of the appointment, we may need to seek confirmation from the patient that they indeed accept this appointment. But obviously the patient is not in the hospital or in the healthcare environment, so this may involve sending them an email, calling them, all sorts of stuff in order to get confirmation from their part. Now this may lead to a direct cancellation. Well, I cannot make that. Okay. Or the sending of multiple appointment reminders to the patient, including one, let's say, 24 hours before the actual appointment to increase the chances of people actually showing up. And then the patient arrives, and then we have finally the encounter. Okay? And obviously when we cancel the appointment, this may lead to a modification of the appointment. I cannot make 9 to 9:30. But I can make 10:30 to 11. That's a modification of the appointment, which then means finding potential appointments, slots on hold, etc. So then the game will start again. Okay. So let's zoom into some of these statuses in this business life cycle, so to speak, for appointments. So first, search for potential appointments. And this could be on all sorts of search criteria, but from a patient perspective, let's say you had a regional scheduling application, or even a national one would be the ideal situation, obviously, that, okay, I need to see a podiatrist I don't have any treatment relationship with anybody at this point in time, so give me all podiatrists in my neighborhood who have an open slot next week Tuesday. So then your query becomes things like specialty, maybe practitioner type, available times, maybe the location, maybe based on your GPS coordinates where you are right now. Give me a neighboring specialist of a certain kind. Why not? And maybe the query parameter could include a simple procedure. Like I want to have a wart removed. That's something that the patient can schedule. You cannot schedule, I want to have my appendix removed. Okay, that needs a bit more than just scheduling in order to deal with that. Okay, so find appointments, search for all sorts of stuff. The patient has certain search criteria, and healthcare providers, if it's used internally, have more search criteria, obviously, because, well, they know what they're doing, so they can schedule things like specific rooms, specific devices. Now, Organ Argonaut, the US FHIR implementation guide, uses an operation to find open slots, that potential appointments, so to speak. And I think they're right. This operation should probably be included in the FHIR specification itself. The thing is, you're manipulating quite a lot of resources in an atomic fashion, in a transactional fashion. I want all of these statuses of all of these appointments and all of these slots to change at one point in time. Accepted, 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 agreed, booked, everything at one point in time. And the complexity behind this, to find an applicable healthcare provider and find an applicable slot, is so complex. You don't want a client to have that power. You want that intelligence to be on the server side. So hence, they have an operation, and this, as I said, for any non-trivial appointments, you will probably need such an operation to come up with what are the potential time slots for a particular set of resources, or what the patient or somebody else is aiming to do. Now, once we have a time slot, and maybe put it on hold for a while until we have additional substantiating details, then we move into booking it, confirming it. Okay? So then we have this situation again where you see an appointment. It's a proposed appointment here in this image, which has, in this case, 3 participants. Remember, in this case, we need the patient, we need Dr. Hippocrates, and we need a particular room, and the room has its own agenda as well, its own schedule. Hence, we see that the room is related to a different slot from a different schedule than Dr. Hippocrates, which is related to that slot. Okay? So now if you book an appointment, and that was the point that I just made, you need to change this status, that status, this status, that status, that status, and the overall appointment status in one atomic sweep. Hence, the whole idea of doing this by means of an operation is probably a good one. Okay? Now, if the patient is not the party that's making the appointment, then, as I said, we may have to send them a paper letter, a web portal, or even more frankly, send them an email with an ICal scheduling request. You have an appointment with your doctor next week Tuesday, do you agree? Okay. And then the ICal confirmation goes back, the appointment response, so to speak, goes back to the sending party, and you can link it up with your FHIR stuff again. That would be nice. And in this ICal scheduling request, you could include a URL which goes to a web form, so that if they want to reschedule it for another point in time, that they get a pre-populated form that allows them to choose some other point in time. That would really be a friendly way of doing this from a patient perspective. Now, the patient may indeed choose to reschedule, to go for a different slot for a different point in time because they cannot make it for one reason or another. So we have rescheduling, that's the same set of resources but at a different point in time. And we have amending, modifying an appointment, and then we're going to involve other resources that were not involved before. add a device or add a different room or something like that. So here we see an appointment that has been finalized. You see it's accepted, it's finalized, it's booked. We have a slot that's busy. And then the patient says, nah, can't make that. Okay? So then we need to move to the situation where we have a newly proposed appointment where the participants still need to state whether they can make it or not, need action. We see that the old slot is now free again, and that the new slot is busy, tentative, so it's on hold, penciled in, because we're waiting for final confirmation. So this is rescheduling, same resources, but at a different point in time. Then we have the fact that the patient arrives. So based on our appointment, the appointment changes the status to arrived. What patient? Well, Adam Everyman in his appointment with Dr. Hippocrates, and he has arrived at this point in time at 9:47, and he's sitting in the waiting room. Okay, so his face-to-face appointment with Dr. Hippocrates has not started yet. That would be 0 to star location, would be another location in here to show that he's now actually in the room with Dr. Hippocrates. But we can denote the fact that he has arrived, that he's waiting in the waiting room, and even where he's sitting maybe in the waiting room. All right? Now, how does all of this relate to orders? Because it's sort of implied that if you schedule something, that there is a prior agreement to do something. If I schedule a surgery or schedule an image to be taken, you're kind of assuming that the party already agrees to do that. And that's sort of the difference in the mind of HL7 between scheduling and orders. Is the order is the request to do something in principle at some future point in time with unknown resources. Okay, so the party then communicates, yes, I'm willing to do it. That's the request and the response, the order. And after you have agreed to do it, then you are going to use scheduling to identify with what resources, what imaging equipment, what persons are going to be involved, etc. So one effectively leads to the other. Or as it's modeled in FHIR, the schedule is based on the underlying service request. In this case, the patient is receiving food care because they have, apparently they require edema therapy. Now, if you want to schedule complex clinical activities, okay, let's say you want to schedule a hip replacement procedure, well, you can imagine that involves a whole series of scheduled appointments and a whole series of resources. Now, you could probably define this. There is a care plan resource, or as a plan definition or something. You can define exactly what should be there. But so then you have to be aware of this definition, this appointment template. And one way of then supporting that would be, again, to use a FHIR operation. Because, again, the complexity is way beyond what you would wish a regular FHIR client to support. Then we have tracking appointments. So if we want to do tracking, again via polling or subscription to get hold of the details. So for example, the top one is to find all appointments for a particular patient that have the status booked or cancelled. So this would be relevant for a particular patient. In this example, we're using the National Citizen Identifier to do the querying, so we get hold of all appointments. Or the bottom one is to get hold, let's say, of the agenda of a particular practitioner, where we use the National Practitioner Identifier to query for any slots that have these statuses. One of the statuses you saw was busy tentative, that's penciled in. But as long as it's not final, you're not really interested in that. that you might as well be free as far as you are concerned at that point in time. Then, the underlying reason for the appointment. If you make an appointment, I told you that sometimes you may wish to put stuff on hold until you have sufficient information to finalize the appointment request. So if this is our proposed appointment, in other words the appointment request, then there are a couple of ways to denote the detailed information. So here we have an element that's called reason. So you can at least send a code, a high-level code as to what the reason for this appointment is. Or more on the right-hand side, we can link or reference supporting information. So that's any clinical resource basically. Or we have the link to a prior service request. This appointment is done because of a prior request to perform something. Just hold off a second if you want. Okay. So to summarize, okay, now you've seen the highlights of scheduling. Scheduling is all about resource planning with a small r, not a big R, because then we're talking about FHIR resources, right? We have this scheduling transaction pattern with a centralized scheduler, a tracker, a querying party, and a party that actually wishes to create the appointments. And all of that is supported by the FHIR standard. And the core FHIR resources are slot, schedule, and appointment. And you also have the appointment response, but those are the three core ones. And we've seen the appointment lifecycle: find, hold, book, arrives, and completed. So that includes all of the business, the life cycle of the appointment. And there was a question near the front already.
Relating to supporting information for an appointment, how would you describe using FHIR that, so we have the appointment, it's been proposed, and now Dr. Hippocrates says, I will accept this if you send me this supporting information. How do we put this in FHIR?
I think a standard extension? I have no clue. I haven't thought about that, but that's obviously a step in the workflow. You're going to keep this appointment in its status, so it will be a different communication mechanism, different resources maybe. Communication maybe to communicate to the fact that I need additional details before I can finalize this.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi. My question is for the storage or backend layer. When you have thousands of millions of registers, you need to efficient layer for storage and different layer for to communicate quickly the information. Do you have some recommendation or to storage some part of resource and other part in storage more persistent?
Well, I can not give you any recommendations, so to do in a generalized fashion. When it's about this subject area, then most of this stuff is mostly bolted on top of existing scheduling applications. So you'll have to work with their particular storage way of storing these scheduling and the appointments. So specific to this area, there is no real guidance there because mostly you won't have the choice. It's on top of legacy environments, mostly.
The appointment can be based on a service request, a procedure. How do you, when the procedure is executed, is it then still linked to the appointment, or how do you see that?
Well, it is, because this service request has obviously a status code in it. So this status code will only be performed or finalized once obviously the appointment has taken place. or even much later than that, because there may be multiple appointments or encounters as part of one simple service request. So, but the status of this one is maintained independently from the status of the underlying appointments and what the rules are. But back to your question, this reference will obviously keep to be there. That's a persistent reference. So in that sense, the reference will be maintained or kept on storage.
But the appointment will have a lifetime, but when the patient is admitted and has got an encounter, I suppose the procedure will take place on basis on that encounter, and the appointment will be not forgotten, but closed.
Yes, definitely. Once the appointment has taken place, when an encounter has happened, then obviously the appointment gains a status that says has taken place. And then it doesn't really have a value anymore, other than for record keeping. Question in the back of the room, maybe?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just a question about the series of appointments. Yeah, you mentioned that the scheduler should be aware of the appointment template. So my question is, where is this defined, or how this definition should
Well,
be
that's the problem. That would be up to you to, because for complex, there is no way for FHIR itself or for HL7 to define what appropriate definitions are. So it would be up to a project or an implementation guide to define what the definitions are.
Okay.
There are resources to do all of that in plan definition and in care definition and that sort of stuff on the definitional side, but that's where you would look to define how these templates should look like.
Okay, yeah. Thanks.
My question is related to the financial class information that in HL7 version 2 is available also in encounter, because it's in patient visit, while here in FHIR I can see it in appointment. Okay, probably there's an information related to the financial, who is going to pay for this appointment, so I can identify the proper slots available. But then when I reach the encounter resources, I don't have this attribute related at the base level of the encounter itself, but I have to go through account or claims or other related resources. And the encounter is not still alive when I am going to reserve, but the resources is. So I think that is, I'm not sure how to manage this information in the encounter.
Well, the thing to do is obviously then to create, if it's not in the current encounter resource, or if the reference doesn't go the other direction from the claim or whatever financial resource you want to use back to encounter, is to create a proposal to HL7 to add it or to create an extension. It's a non-answer, I know that, but that's the only real thing we can do.
Thanks for a great talk. Question regarding a rebooking. If you have an appointment that's been accepted, is there a defined way to determine whether an appointment can be rebooked at all? Like, cannot be rebooked if it's less than 24 hours until it happens, or some mechanism?
No, that will be a server-based rule, and yet more a reason to do this in the form of an operation, because then the operation can just spit out a failure. Because if you do it manually, if you start manipulating the resources manually as a client, there is no way to enforce that particular business rule. A very good example, by the way.
Okay, thanks.
Are there any libraries available that already implement those operations like booking or?
No, well, as I said, in the US you have the Argonaut implementation guide, so I'm fairly sure that there have been quite a few implementations of those operations, but whether there is a freely available library, I don't know. I think it's probably the vendors that have each implemented their own way of doing this. So I'm not aware of any library at this point in time.
Hi, I have two questions. The first one is, what about exception handling? Perhaps concurrent modification of the appointment slots. And the second one is, how does it interact with the IHE scheduled workflow profile?
Okay. The first one, then my answer would be operations. So that if you allow the client to manipulate the statuses individually, then you run into all sorts of clashes. So you probably don't want that. So yeah, use these operations that we saw before: $book, $find, and that sort of thing. Scheduled workflow, for those not in the know, is an IHE workflow that describes workflows in radiology. But actually, scheduled workflow doesn't include any scheduling. That's a bit strange, but it's they use the word schedule to denote that it's not about emergency patients, that it's about normal, regular scheduled patients. So in that sense, there is no real relationship. I know that some parties in IHE are looking to transform some of their current workflows to use FHIR. But as far as I know, scheduled workflow is not very high on the list, because that has a very wide implementation base, and there is no real reason to migrate that to FHIR at this point in time. All right, maybe a final one, and then we'll go for the break.
Hello. A question that is more like because of the business. Stored slots with a schedule definition or dynamic generated slots?
I didn't get the question, I must admit.
Maybe we can store the schedule with the slots, right? And maybe for search, for making the search is better. But some business roles needs to dynamic generating the slots. So
yeah, well, I explicitly left that out of the presentation, but yes, you can actually dynamically create the slots if and when somebody starts booking them. So if I'm going to suggest by an appointment that I want to have an appointment between 10:22 and 10:47, which is ridiculous normally, but let's say you want to have that, and then the scheduling system says, okay, click, I will create a new slot for you that explicitly for that point in time. So you can do that. A schedule can have slots that are unequal in size as well. So you can have 7-minute slots and then have a couple of 15-minute slots. So you can do that sort of stuff as well. So dynamic slots is not uncommon, but I left it out because it just makes things rather more complicated rather than easy for you guys to understand. But certainly that would work. Okay, with that, thanks again. I hope that proves useful in your future usage of FHIR. And just for a bit of fun, if you're new to these meetings, you may not have seen these. Okay, it ties in with the scheduling topic. This is the FHIR calendar. Okay, and if you don't have one and would like to have one, just step over here. I've got a few left. With that, thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.